Breaking news tonight as high-stakes trade negotiations between Canada and the United States intensify in Washington. Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been meeting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in what sources describe as urgent discussions to resolve the ongoing tariff dispute. After a productive 90-minute meeting, both sides are signaling potential movement on key trade issues that have strained relations between the two longtime allies. Canadian officials are pushing hard to get the Trump administration to reconsider their position on tariffs.
A source tells me that there is a sense of urgency right now, that the Canadian side sees a window to try and land a trade deal with the U.S., but the source also says that there are no guarantees that it will happen in the next few weeks. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is here right now in Washington. He met with Donald Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, this morning and posted a photo online calling it a productive meeting. LeBlanc's office says it lasted about 90 minutes, and it's all part of Canada's efforts to try and get the Trump administration to drop or at least lower a series of tariffs hitting Canadian sectors hard. Here's what the Prime Minister said today.
Aluminum, steel, autos, copper. They happen to have a specific on copper, and then of course lumber, softwood lumber, which has been an issue. So those are the areas where immediately we are focused on improving the outcomes. In order to do that, we will have to look at other areas where we can have win-win cooperation, other areas.
Today's meeting here in Washington comes after the Prime Minister announced last week that he would drop some retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. because he says he was given assurance by Donald Trump over the phone that it would intensify talks.
And Ashley, you've learned more details about how this meeting came about. What can you tell us?
JP, the Canadian source tells me that after the Prime Minister's announcement that he would drop some of those countermeasures, that Mark Carney and Donald Trump exchanged texts and that they agreed LeBlanc would come here to Washington for these talks. The source also said there was a recognition from
The atmosphere in Washington appears more constructive than it has been in months, with meetings running longer than scheduled and additional meetings being planned.
Well, I'm very encouraged. So as a former policymaker, it is really good to see the constructive meetings that happened. Just the very fact that the meeting ran longer than scheduled is yesterday with Minister LeBlanc and Secretary Lutnick is really, really encouraging. And that suggests that there is real progress in these talks. We have more talks coming today. That is good. And again, suggests that there is progress happening here and that it is possible that a deal could be coming sometime.
Prime Minister Trudeau has outlined several priority areas for these negotiations, including aluminum, steel, automobiles, copper, and softwood lumber. These sectors represent billions of dollars in cross-border trade and thousands of jobs on both sides of the border. The current round of talks follows Canada's strategic decision to drop some retaliatory tariffs last week, a move that came after President Trump personally assured Canadian officials he would intensify negotiations. Meanwhile, a major legal development could reshape the entire trade landscape. A U.S. federal appeals court has ruled that most of President Trump's tariffs are illegal, citing presidential overreach of trade authority. While the tariffs remain in effect pending appeal to the Supreme Court, this ruling has major implications for international trade and the economy.
Good evening. U.S. President Donald Trump has called tariff the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Today, a U.S. federal appeals court called them illegal. In a split decision, the judges ruled the president overstepped his powers by implementing certain tariffs, but stopped short of blocking them. The decision could have major consequences for the president's agenda and the world economy, including Canada's. CTV's Mike LeCouture is in Ottawa with the story for us tonight. Mike.
Well, Marcia, nothing changes for any trading partners, including Canada, because the court also said the tariffs can remain in place as the case proceeds. But this is the second court to rule that U.S. President Donald Trump has overstepped his authority by imposing across-the-board duties on imports from dozens of countries. Now, today's ruling is on the 35% tariffs that are being applied to Canadian goods which are not covered by our trade agreement with the U.S. That's also known as CUSMA. It does not affect the punishing tariffs that are being applied to steel, aluminum, copper, or the auto industry, which were applied under a separate act. Trump did respond on his social media, writing in all caps, "All tariffs are still in effect." He called the appeals court highly partisan, adding, quote, "If these tariffs ever went away, it would be a total disaster for the country. It would make us financially weak, and we have to be strong." The court basically said the power to impose tariffs rests with Congress, not the president. An American lawyer who argued against the U.S. government says this decision sends a message that President Trump can't impose tariffs on his own.
You've got the president who's imposed the largest tax increase on American consumers since 1993 in the form of these tariffs. That's according to the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation. And he did it without Congress saying one word. That is not our constitutional structure.
The economic stakes couldn't be higher for Canada. New data shows the Canadian economy contracted by 1.6% in the second quarter, marking the steepest decline since the pandemic. Vehicle exports have plummeted by 25%, and the country is facing an unprecedented $19.6 billion trade deficit. Business investment has collapsed as companies struggle with uncertainty, and economists have warned that a recession could be on the horizon.
Marcia, the downturn driven by the ongoing trade war, signaling signs of a possible recession. After months of being assaulted by U.S. tariffs and battered by the ongoing trade war, Canada now showing major cracks in the armor.
This is not a good picture for Canada and what's happening here.
Canada's economy contracted in the second quarter much more than expected, shrinking by 1.6% on an annualized basis. It's the first quarterly contraction in nearly 2 years and the steepest decline since the pandemic.
Essentially, the big change was in the first quarter, we had a rush to get exports out into the U.S. as quickly as possible. In the second quarter, that all came to a halt as some of these tariffs started to take effect.
U.S. President Donald Trump ramped up tariffs against Canada and the world that quarter, targeting steel, aluminum, and autos, while April, May, and June then saw a sharp drop-off in business investment by roughly 10%.
The depth of decline that we're seeing in the manufacturing sector is something that we haven't seen in many years. And so it is a cause for concern.
Vehicle exports plummeting nearly 25%, industrial machinery exports and travel services also falling drastically. In fact, Canada saw an unprecedented trade deficit in the second quarter, with a big gap between its minimal exports versus its massive amount of imports. The difference between the two, a whopping $19.6 billion in goods and services.
Well, guess what's happening in the middle of a trade war with the U.S.? We're exporting substantially less stuff to our major trade partner.
All of it raising fears of a recession, which economists say Canada would be in if the GDP sees another decline in the third quarter of this year.
In response to these troubling economic indicators, the Bank of Canada is closely monitoring the situation. With the current interest rate at 2.75%, markets are pricing in about a 50% chance of a rate cut on September 17th. Canada's success in controlling inflation gives the central bank more flexibility compared to the Federal Reserve's challenges with inflation.
The question is, now what? First of all, what does this mean for interest rates? Because the Bank of Canada, of course, watches these numbers extremely closely. They haven't changed the rate in a little while, currently set at 2.75%, the interest rate. That very likely could be in play again on September 17th when the bank announces its next change to the interest rates, very likely to come down at least a little bit. The market pricing in about a 50% chance currently of an interest rate cut. In large part also because Canada is doing pretty well at controlling inflation. So this is always the risk, and you see this happening in the United States, the debate over the Fed in the U.S. about whether or not they should accede to Donald Trump's repeated demands to lower interest rates at the risk of driving up inflation because of the United States has put tariffs pretty much on all imports into their country. So that's a different balancing act than we have here in Canada. The bank's got a little bit of more wiggle room here to move. We could move to reduced interest rates without potentially...
The ripple effects of Trump's trade policies extend far beyond North America. In a shocking escalation, the United States has imposed a massive 50% tariff on Indian exports, targeting sectors like gems, jewelry, auto components, and textiles. This punitive measure appears to be retaliation for India's continued purchases of Russian oil despite Western pressure.
Washington to forge closer ties with New Delhi. Rebecca Bundan is with me now live, and she has the very latest. These tariffs now in effect, how will they affect, Rebecca, the tariffs on these Indian exports? How will that affect the U.S. marketplace and Indian business interests?
Yes, and this move by President Donald Trump is certainly a big blow to ties between India and the US, which have been growing closer in recent years. And we've seen Prime Minister Narendra Modi here and President Trump seeming to have a good relationship. So in some ways, this is a bit of a surprise that things have deteriorated so quickly. But that is a
Prime Minister Modi has responded defiantly, stating that India will continue to build its economy and import oil from wherever it gets the best rates. This confrontation between the world's largest democracy and its most powerful economy threatens to destabilize global trade relationships and could push India closer to Russia and China. Back home, Canadian public opinion on the trade dispute reveals complex attitudes. New polling from Nanos Research shows that Canadians support retaliatory tariffs against U.S. imports, even if it means paying higher prices at the checkout.
It's interesting, Roger. We ask about Canadians or the Canadian government whether there be support for tariffs on imports from U.S. goods coming into Canada, even if the prices go up. And what's clear is that Canadians are much more likely to support rather than oppose tariffs on the imports from the U.S. And, you know, the thing is that, you know, even when we look at whether they think that a deal with the U.S. is worth signing, if it includes some sort of tariffs on Canadian imports, it's much more of a mixed bag. You can see that people are more likely to oppose rather than support. So, you know, the thing is that Canadians are okay with tariffs and paying for the cost, but they are not hot on a deal that could include tariffs on Canadian goods and are worried about the trade-offs on that front.
However, the same polling reveals deep skepticism about President Trump's reliability as a negotiating partner. Canadians have little confidence that Trump would honor any trade deal even if one is signed. Many view his constant demands for changes as a deliberate tactic, keeping trading partners constantly off balance and uncertain.
Yeah, you know, these numbers really popped, and, you know, it speaks to the environment. You can see that, you know, Canadians don't really have a lot of confidence that U.S. President Trump will honor his word, even if a trade deal is signed between Canada and the United States. And, you know, what's clear, at least for a lot of Canadians at least, is they see Donald Trump, and this is part of his negotiating strategy, is to always ask for more, always change things, always keep his opponents or his, what do we say, his negotiating counterparty off balance. And that's just part of the way the guy operates. That's why he, you know, love or hate him, he has been a success. He is the president of the United States. But, you know, the thing is that even if a trade deal is signed between Canada and the United States, there will be lingering doubts as to whether the terms of that trade deal will be enforced and whether they're in place.
Okay, Nick, thanks.
As these negotiations continue, businesses on both sides of the border are struggling with unprecedented uncertainty. Supply chains that have operated smoothly for decades are being disrupted, investment decisions are being postponed, and workers in trade-dependent industries are facing an anxious future. The coming weeks will be critical in determining whether North America's integrated economy can survive this period of tension, or whether we're witnessing a fundamental restructuring of continental trade relationships that have been in place since the 1980s.